Ohtani canceled the flight 20 minutes before departure. The bags were already loaded. That is the detail that makes this story impossible to dismiss as routine. Not the cancellation itself. Cancellations happen in baseball, for reasons that range from the mundane to the significant, and the machinery of a major league roster absorbs them without breaking stride. But the bags were already loaded. The travel party was already assembled. The plane that was supposed to carry the Los Angeles Dodgers to New York was sitting on the tarmac in the particular state of readiness that precedes departure, engines warming, crew positioned, the organized momentum of a team in transit already in motion. And then something happened. And 20 minutes before wheels up, Shohei Ohtani was no longer on the flight. Not delayed. Not pulled aside for a conversation that would resolve quickly and send him up the stairs with the rest of the team. Gone. From the manifest. From the gate. From the travel party that continued to New York without him, while the reason for his absence moved through the organization like a current that nobody wanted to name out loud. 20 minutes. In baseball, 20 minutes before departure is not a window for new information. It is not the moment when conversations about significant decisions are supposed to begin. It is the moment when everything has already been decided and the only remaining task is the physical act of moving from one city to another. Someone had waited until that window to deliver information that changed everything. And Ohtani, when he received it, said 5 words that ended the conversation immediately. If that's true, I won't play. The unprecedented issue did not arrive without warning. That is the harder truth underneath the dramatic surface of what happened at the airport. The cancellation, the 20-minute window, the loaded bags, the plane that left without its most important passenger, was the visible eruption of something that had been building beneath the surface for longer than one day. Longer, probably, than most people inside the organization wanted to acknowledge publicly. There had been conversations. The kind that happen in the spaces between official communications, in the language of athletic organizations that have learned how to discuss significant problems without ever saying the significant thing directly. There had been decisions made and then revisited. There had been information that existed in one part of the organization that had not fully reached another part of the organization in the timeframe that it should have. And there had been, at the center of all of it, a matter involving Ohtani's situation, his body, his role, his availability, that had been handled in a way that left a gap between what he had been told and what was actually true. The gap had been manageable, for a time, while it remained small. It had not remained small. And by the time it reached Ohtani, by the time the information arrived in the form that made those 5 words the only possible response, the gap had become something that 20 minutes before a flight to New York could not contain. Dave Roberts found out the way managers find out about things they should have been told earlier. Too late, and from the wrong direction. He was not the first person Ohtani spoke to after receiving the information. He was not the person who delivered the information. He was not, in the architecture of what happened in those 20 minutes, positioned anywhere near the center of the event. He was on the periphery of it, a manager whose player had just made a decision that the manager had not been consulted about, responding to a situation that had developed outside the channels that he was supposed to be part of. When he reached Ohtani, the conversation was not long. It did not need to be long. The 5 words had already established the terms. If that's true, I won't play. Roberts had heard them secondhand before he heard them directly, and by the time he was standing in front of the man who had said them, he already understood that this was not a negotiation. This was not a moment for the kind of careful managerial language that he has learned over years of navigating between players and organizations and the complicated space where those two things meet. This was a moment that required something different. Roberts bowed his head. Not metaphorically. Not in the loose figurative sense that sports language sometimes uses to indicate deference or acknowledgement. He bowed his head. Physically. In the direct, unambiguous way that the gesture carries its meaning without requiring interpretation. He apologized. To Shohei Ohtani. 20 minutes before a flight to New York. In the particular quiet of an airport space that had become, without anyone planning for it, the location of one of the most significant exchanges of the Dodgers season. Roberts is not a man who apologizes easily. That is not a criticism, it is simply an accurate description of how he carries himself in the difficult moments that his role requires him to navigate. He is measured. He is considered. He does not perform accountability, he practices it, quietly and without drama, in the way that people who take responsibility seriously tend to do it. Which is why the bow meant something. Which is why the apology, when it reached the people who heard about it in the hours that followed, landed with a weight that a statement or a press release or any official communication could not have carried. Roberts had known, or should have known, that something was wrong earlier than he did. The system that was supposed to keep him informed had failed. And whether or not the failure was his directly, the person standing in front of him was his player, and the impact of that failure had landed on that player in the worst possible window. He bowed his head. And the plane left without Ohtani on it. The GM's announcement came hours later. By then, the story had already begun moving through the channels that sports information moves through when something significant happens and the official version is still being prepared. The absence from the flight manifest. The departure of the team without their two-way star. The fragments of information that circulate in the space between what happened and what is officially confirmed, these things had already generated the particular energy that precedes a major announcement. When the announcement came, it confirmed what the fragments had been suggesting. 50 days. The GM stood in front of the microphone with the expression of someone delivering information he would have preferred not to deliver in this way, on this timeline, under these circumstances. The statement had been prepared carefully. The language was precise. The medical framing was present, the explanation of what the 50 days represented in terms of treatment and recovery and the structured return that would follow. But what the language could not fully absorb, what existed in the room around the carefully prepared statement, was the context. The 50 days had not been announced on a planned schedule. They had been announced in the aftermath of an airport cancellation, 20 minutes before a flight, following an apology from a manager who was bowing his head in a space that nobody had anticipated would become the location of any of this. The 50 days existed before the announcement. That was the thing the statement couldn't say directly but that everyone in the room already understood. The information had existed. The timeline had been known, or developing, or at minimum suspected, in the medical and organizational conversations that had been happening in the days before the airport. And the gap between when that information crystallized internally and when it reached Ohtani, the gap that produced those 5 words, that produced Roberts' apology, that produced the loaded bags and the cancelled flight and the plane that went to New York without him. That gap was the real story. If that's true, I won't play. Let's stay with those words for a moment. Because they are doing more work than they might appear to be doing on the surface. They are not the words of someone reacting emotionally to bad news. They are not the words of someone who has been surprised by information they had no reason to anticipate. They are the words of someone who has received a confirmation, who has had something they suspected, or had been told was not the case, or had been given insufficient information about, finally arrive in its true form. If that's true. The conditional matters. It is not I can't believe this is true. It is not I didn't know this was possible. It is the conditional of someone who had been operating with incomplete information and had just received the piece that completed the picture in a way that changed the calculation entirely. Ohtani had been carrying a version of this story that didn't match the version being managed around him. The true version arrived 20 minutes before a flight to New York. And the moment it did, everything else, the travel, the game, the Yankees, the standings, the season narrative that had been building around him, became secondary to the single most important fact. He had not been told the truth on the timeline he deserved to be told it. And he was not going to New York until that was acknowledged. The team arrived in New York without him. That sentence carries more weight than its simple factual content suggests. The Dodgers traveling to face the Yankees without Shohei Ohtani is not merely a roster matter. It is not simply a question of lineup construction and pitching plans and how Roberts would manage the absence of his most valuable and most complicated asset. It is a statement about what had happened in the hours before departure, a physical manifestation, visible to anyone who was paying attention to the travel party, that something significant had broken down. The players who made that flight knew it. The coaching staff knew it. The people within the organization who had been part of the conversations that led to the gap between what Ohtani had been told and what was true, knew it in the particular way that people know things when the consequences of an error have become impossible to contain. The Yankees knew it by the time the Dodgers arrived. Everyone knew it. Because in baseball, when the most important player on the most scrutinized team in the sport does not get on a plane 20 minutes before departure, and when the manager of that team bows his head and apologizes before the plane leaves, it does not stay private for long. The 50 days will pass. They will pass in the way that all recovery timelines pass, sometimes faster than expected, sometimes slower, always with the particular texture of waiting that athletes and teams experience differently than the people observing from outside. There will be updates. There will be carefully worded progress reports. There will be the gradual movement toward a return date that, this time, the organization will handle differently than it handled the last one. Or it will handle it the same way. That is the question underneath everything that happened today. Not whether Ohtani will return, he will return, because he always does, because the competitive instinct that made him say those 5 words in an airport 20 minutes before a flight is the same instinct that has carried him back from everything that has tried to slow him down. The question is whether the people around him have understood what today was actually about. Not the 50 days. Not the medical timeline. Not even the cancelled flight or the loaded bags or the plane that went to New York without its most important passenger. What today was about was a gap. Between what Ohtani was told and what was true. Between the timeline the organization was managing and the timeline Ohtani deserved to be part of. Between the image of a situation under control and the reality of a situation that had slipped past the window when it could have been handled cleanly. Roberts understood it. That is what the bow meant. That is what the apology communicated in the quiet of an airport space that nobody had planned for. The GM understood it. That is what the announcement's timing communicated, not the content, but the circumstances surrounding it. The 50 days had been true before today. The announcement had arrived today because today it could no longer be managed any other way. Whether the system that produced the gap understands it, whether the machinery that allowed information to reach Ohtani in the worst possible window rather than the right one has been examined and corrected. That is not something that press releases answer. That is something that the next 50 days will reveal. Ohtani did not go to New York. He stayed. With his right knee, and his 5 words, and the weight of a situation that had arrived at the worst possible moment in the worst possible way. He stayed with the knowledge that a manager had bowed his head in an airport and meant it. He stayed with the knowledge that 50 days is not forever, that he has come back from harder things, in harder circumstances, with less acknowledgement from the people around him than he received today. He stayed. And the bags that had already been loaded were quietly taken off the plane. And the flight went to New York. And somewhere in the particular silence of a decision made and a line drawn and a truth finally spoken in a 5-word sentence that ended the conversation completely. Shohei Ohtani waited. The way he always does. Precisely. And on his own terms.